Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Calm in the Time of Coronavirus, our Natural Mental Health Resilience Retreat. So I'm Henry Emmons.
I'm Dr. Tim Colbert.
And I'm Amy Pricelik.
So tonight, the topic is the nature of mind. And really, what we're talking about is one of my favorite topics because it comes so naturally to me, and that is thinking. How we get caught up in our thinking. It's something I've had to work pretty hard on to try to get a little more skilled at. But we're going to introduce that incredibly important topic and how you can deal with your own thinking mind. But let me start by setting some context here. I want to read for you the first couple of stanzas from the Dhammapada, which is really the oldest Buddhist text that we have access to. So here are the first two stanzas. We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Speak or act with an impure mind, and trouble will follow you as surely as the wheel follows the ox that draws the cart. We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Speak or act with a pure mind, and happiness will follow you as closely as your shadow, unshakable. So I think the fact that this is how this ancient Buddhist text begins tells us something about the importance, the primacy of thought and the thinking mind. Now there's a much more recent book, one of my favorites and one of my favorite authors in the mind-body field. His name is Robert Sapolsky. And he wrote a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. As the title implies, what he's talking about in this book is how differently the natural world, particularly animals that don't have a lot of contact with humans, how differently they deal with stress, and that they don't carry their stress with them, but humans do. And so his point is that we have a much greater tendency to have these chronic medical conditions that are almost all related in one way or another to stress, whereas you don't see them, at least not often, in the natural world. So Sapolsky says, this is a quote of his that I just love. He says, "We humans have evolved to be smart enough to make ourselves sick." I want to share an example with you. It's an example from my own life, and I use it just because it's such a clear example of this. Not that this is the only way it manifests, but this is one way. So let me just tell you my story. About 5 or 6 years ago, I was really struggling with hip pain. Had pain in my left hip, and I'd actually been dealing with some degree of hip pain for quite a while, a number of years, in fact. But at this time, my wife and I had gone on a trip out west, and we did some hiking in the mountains. And when I came back, I was in a lot more pain than I was used to. So I went to a physical therapist, and he did some work on me, somebody I'd been seeing, and it helped a little, but he said, you might have something more going on here. I think you should go to the sports medicine doctor, get some x-rays and so forth. So I did that, got some x-rays, and then I got an MRI scan. And the doctor told me that I had some sort of a congenital hip problem. So this had been with me my whole life. I just hadn't known about it. But it's the sort of thing where there was too narrow of a space in this hip joint. And so over time, if that's not addressed, it'll cause some erosion of tissue, and that creates pain, sort of an arthritic kind of pain. But he said, I know a guy in the city, he's an orthopedic surgeon. He's the best there is in this. I'm going to send these x-rays and MRI scan up to him. He can do a procedure, kind of a simple thing to create a little more space here, and it usually takes care of it. You'll get another good 20, 25 years from it. So I'm thinking, great, this is just what I was hoping to hear. So about 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from this surgeon's nurse, and she said, Dr. So-and-so looked at your x-rays and he said, you've got too much damage. There's really nothing he can do for you. You just have to wait until you can't tolerate the pain anymore and then get a hip replacement. So that was unsettling and I wasn't expecting it. So I hung up the phone, and I'm not kidding you. Within 2 minutes, my hip hurt about 2 or 3 times worse than it did before that phone call. And why is that? It's because I changed my thoughts about this. All of a sudden, I saw this instead of a temporary curable problem, I saw it as something that was incurable, that was going to get worse. It was going to get so bad I wouldn't be able to stand it. And sure enough, that's about how I felt within minutes of hearing that. And then I found over the next days when I started telling people about this, every time I told them about it, it started hurting worse again. So that taught me something about the power of thought to change even something like the body and physical pain. Now, so human beings, like Sapolsky says, human beings have this really unique capacity to generate thought and have that thought influence our experience of the world. But there's another human capacity that is really unique and even more powerful because it magnifies this problem many times over. And that is, we humans have the ability not only to create thought, but to share it with one another. I want to read to you a quote I came across that came from an economic advisor. Let me just read it to you and then I'll explain it. Greed gives way to fear, and this fear begets fear. This is the paradox at the heart of the financial crisis. In the past few years, we've seen too much greed and too little fear. Today, however, the problem is exactly the opposite. It is this transition from an excess of greed to an excess of fear that President Roosevelt had in mind when he famously observed that the only thing we had to fear was fear itself. It is this transition that has happened in the United States today. You might think that that was written this week or last week. It actually came from 2008, and it was a quote by Larry Summers, who was an economic advisor to President Obama during our last major financial crisis. And he's really talking about something that we see today, which is fear begets fear. We can spread it, and we do so at the level of thought. So I want to introduce you to one of the concepts I found most helpful from Buddhist psychology, really from the study of mindfulness. And this is a concept known as the second arrow. So let me describe it the way that I kind of heard it and understand it. If you imagine a warrior back in the day with bows and arrows or maybe spears and out in the battlefield, which is essentially a metaphor for being involved in the game of life. If you're living your life and you're doing so openly, you are taking risks and you are at risk of being hurt or wounded. And so being out on the battlefield, then imagine that warrior is struck by an enemy's arrow. That is what's known as the first arrow. And it's really considered unavoidable to some extent. I mean, if we're fighting a battle, we're going to do everything we can to protect ourselves. But no matter how good your efforts, you still are vulnerable to getting struck. In other words, to being wounded or to being hurt. So suffering, this is what I think is meant by the first noble truth, that all of life is suffering or experiences suffering. It means that none of us are exempt. We all experience loss. We all experience pain, suffering, whatever it is. That's the source, the original source of feeling badly in some way. But then if you imagine that warrior takes another arrow out of his own quiver and stabs himself with it, that's what's known as the second arrow. And this is where we have some leverage. This is where we can do something different to change how much damage something like this causes. So in my example with my hip, my congenital hip problem and the wear and tear that I'd experienced over the years, that was the first arrow. Maybe if I'd known about it earlier, I could have had that surgery and avoided it. But as it was, there was nothing I could do really to avoid that. However, the second arrow was my reaction to it, my thinking about it, my fear, my giving my attention even more directly to the pain itself, which clearly made it grow. And then over time, I started to avoid things. There were things that, activities that I'd always done to stay active and in shape, which I thought, well, this is hurting too much or it's causing too much damage, so I have to give these things up. So this second arrow, this reaction to this, ended up causing a lot more discomfort, making things worse because I wasn't as active. So that's an example of something physical. A hip problem isn't so bad and it's nothing I take personally, but you can easily imagine how we do this with things that affect our sense of ourselves. The belief, for example, that we are alone and we're always going to be alone, or that we're unlovable. There's something wrong with us fundamentally. And if we keep focusing on that belief and let that grow, that's really going to impact our experience of life and our relationships. So this happens at small levels, big levels. It happens all of the time. Why does it happen? Because we're not aware that we're doing this to ourselves. If we were, we wouldn't do it. I wouldn't want to make myself have more pain. Nobody wants to feel depressed or anxious. It's not something we're doing on purpose. We're not doing it consciously. And in fact, that really is the crux of the problem, is that this is all happening unconsciously. So the term for this is adventitious suffering, or suffering that we layer on top of the original pain or suffering. So what is the solution to this? How do we get out of this? In a sense, this is really simple. In practice, it's not so easy, but the simple version is we get out of this by learning to recognize that we are thinking. In other words, we have to become the observer of our own inner experience. I really think that this is the crux of what a mindfulness practice is trying to teach us, at least early on, when we're just kind of learning about the mind and learning to observe our experience. The great lesson from that is that we begin to identify ourselves with the part of ourselves that is always there, but we may not know it. The part that is able to stand back from all the drama, all the pain, all the stuff that's going on, and simply see it without judgment, without wishing it were different, but simply to see what's happening as it is happening. That is the observing self, the consciousness or the awareness that is available to all of us. It just has to be activated. It has to be trained. It has to be kind of worked with a little bit. It actually doesn't have to be, we don't have to get perfect at this. We just have to become good enough at it that we're able to step back a little bit from our inner experience and be able to see that much of what's happening, we're making up. We're creating it with our own thoughts. So I want to give you a metaphor for this, or an image, and then I want to invite you to do a brief practice that we'll do together. So there's a couple of metaphors I find helpful. One of them is, if you imagine that that you have something obstructing your vision. Let's just say it's your hand and it's right here in front of your eyes, but it's so close that you don't see it for what it is. You can't see that this is my hand obscuring my vision. You just know I'm not seeing very clearly. But if you take that hand and you move it back just a little bit, just a few inches, before long, you realize, oh, this is my hand. I don't have to have it this close. I can stand back from it a little bit. And then I have a much broader sense of vision. That's kind of a nice, simple way of seeing what our task is, which is to be able to stand back enough from this thinking process that we see that that's all that we're doing, is we're thinking. Another metaphor that I really like is if you imagine, or just picture yourself going to a movie theater, and back when we could go to movie theaters, and you're at a movie that's really engrossing. It just draws you in, and it's so compelling that you forget that you're sitting in the theater watching this movie. And that's a really nice image too, because for most of our lives, we're engaged in this drama that seems so compelling to us. But in fact, a lot of it is taking place at the level of our mind, but we've forgotten that. We're so engaged, we're so drawn in by it that we don't see it for what it is. And so the job then is to become aware, remind yourself that, in fact, you are observing these things happen, but you don't have to be swept up by it. You don't have to let yourself be so engrossed in it that you forget yourself, so to speak. And then the third image, and this is the one we're going to use when we do the practice. The third image is, I think it's really a nice one, and to me it seems pretty clear. And that is, imagine yourself sitting on the banks of a stream. And the stream is your stream of consciousness, or it's your awareness. It is your thoughts that pop up in your field of consciousness, and then they pass on by, much like objects that are floating in that stream. Now, if you can keep yourself sitting on the banks of the stream, rather than finding something that's floating by so interesting that you get in the water and you climb onto it and you're swept downstream with it. That's what we usually do. But if you can recognize that and refrain from it and put yourself back on the banks of that stream, then you keep practicing, observing what's crossing your field of awareness, and let it pass, and it will go. And then something else will come up, and that will eventually pass. As long as you let it pass out of your awareness, it will be gone. Now, something that I think is really helpful and really important to say is that you cannot stop yourself from generating these thoughts. So for my example, I couldn't help myself thinking what I was thinking about my hip, that this is bad, this is going to get worse. The thought just arises on its own, and I don't know where it comes from, and I don't know how to prevent it, and I don't really think that we can. That's not what's important. What's important is that as soon as we recognize that it's a thought, we distance ourselves from it, and we let it pass through our awareness. So just to finish up with my example, before long, I realized what I was doing. It was really pretty obvious to me that the pain increased dramatically as soon as I heard that news and as soon as I gave my attention to it. So I kind of knew what I was doing. I'd had enough experience, perhaps, with mindfulness that I recognized what I was doing. I wasn't able to stop myself from doing it. However, I was able to, before too long, to stop obsessing about it, to just realize that, I can't change this. I'm just going to go on with my life. I'm going to go get back into my activities. About 6 to 8 months after that, I actually took another hiking trip all the way down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon and back up again. And oddly enough, my hip was just fine. I had no problems with my hip. Every other part of my body hurt like crazy, but my hip was fine. And so that's about 5 or 6 years ago. I still haven't had a hip replacement. It actually doesn't bother me much now at all. And I'll probably need a hip replacement someday, but it might be a long time yet. So whatever it is that we get caught up in, we may not be able to change that, but we can definitely change our reaction to it. So in the next few minutes, I'm just going to invite you to join me for a really brief experience. We'll have a lot more meditations that you can access on our website, the naturalmentalhealth.com website. So please go to them and download them or listen to them and keep practicing, because this is really worth doing. But let me just kind of guide you through it here for the next few minutes so you have an experience of it. So if you're comfortable with this, just let yourself sit nice and upright in a relaxed way. Allow your eyes to close if you would like. You don't have to, but it does help with focus just a little bit. And then I like to start by placing your attention just on how you're sitting, how you're holding yourself, the feeling of being supported from below. Whether you're sitting or lying down, just notice the sense of support, the ability to just let your body sink into the ground, into the cushion, into your chair, whatever it is. And still holding yourself upright in a dignified sort of way. I'll invite you to turn your attention to your breath just for a few moments as a way of grounding yourself in your body and in this moment. So for the next 3 breaths, let's say, try to really experience the in-breath, the slight pause between in-breath and out-breath, and then the out-breath. And again, the slight pause between breaths. Now, as you're meditating, no matter how long it is, you probably will find that your attention goes elsewhere. As soon as you notice that, you can bring yourself back. Just notice 1 or 2 or 3 breaths as a way to get yourself back in the moment. And then I would invite you to go back to that image of sitting beside the stream, just on the side of the stream, sitting on the banks. Maybe it's a nice, warm, sunny spring day like we had here today in Minnesota. And you're sitting on the banks of this nice, calmly moving stream, and you're just observing it. You're watching the flow of the water and the flow of whatever is in the stream go past you. And from time to time, you might notice something beyond just the water. Maybe there's an object. Maybe there's a thought, an image, a memory. Maybe you're projecting yourself into the future, the rest of the evening. What do you have planned? What do you need to do? Whatever those things are, see if you can simply notice it, observe it, but not let yourself go with it or entertain it. Simply observe it, touch it lightly with your awareness, and then let it go. And as you continue to sit, you might notice, or you could even invite into your awareness some thought that's troubling, that's just bothersome or makes you feel badly in some way. And if that thought does arise, or if you can conjure it up with your awareness, just see if you can see it for what it is, that it is just your thinking about something. It's not necessarily the reality. And see if you can, again, just notice it, touch it lightly without judging it, and then let it go. And let's just sit for another minute like this. I'll stop talking and you can just sit and observe whatever is in your awareness, even if it feels like there's nothing there. Just observe that and enjoy the calmness. And then whenever you're ready, you can bring yourself back to this moment. Let yourself open your eyes. Going to turn it over to Dr. Colbert in a moment. But let me just remind you that this takes some practice. But it's a little bit like learning to ride a bike for the first time. It can feel really daunting and you got no clue necessarily what I'm talking about or how to do this. But as soon as you have the experience, however unsteady, of being able to do this kind of observing of your inner experience, you get it then. And you can keep practicing and keep riding that bike, getting better at it. And over time, you'll get quite good. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Colbert, who is going to help us understand how to help kids do this kind of thing.
Well, thank you, Henry. That was lovely. And, you know, children do so well with mindfulness as well. And it turns out that mindfulness very much impacts the brain most optimally when you are young. And it really can help the developing nervous system. So it is a lovely technique for children, and it can have lifelong benefits. So the question is, well, how do you explain this to them to convince them it's worth their while? And so a couple of tips I would hope to share with you tonight. I think, first of all, a good explanation for mindfulness I've heard along the way is talking to kids about training or exercising the attention muscles in your brain. So as Henry mentioned, it's all about directing or controlling, in a sense, your attention. And if we think about it in modern life, and most kids are familiar with this scene, you know, we are rushing and doing several things at once. You know, a good example is the average kid that I work with doing homework. They have a cell phone next to them. They're supposedly focusing on their homework. They have a TV on in the background and they're eating a snack. So that's what I would call multitasking. And so what I like to tell kids is mindfulness is exactly the opposite of that situation. It's doing one thing at a time and staying very relaxed in an easy, balanced way on all of the details of the situation that you are focusing on, but just staying with that one thing. It's slowing things down in essence. And it's interesting to note that, and you can talk with kids about this, mindfulness happens naturally very often. I'll give you an example. Just the other day, I was doing a jigsaw puzzle with one of my grandkids, and we just noticed that we were really into it, kind of like being in the zone if you're an athlete. And he was totally focused, this little 4-year-old grandchild of mine, David. And you know, we were doing the puzzle on the floor. He was really enjoying it. He was looking at all the pieces. He was very quiet. He was kind of contemplating where everything went. He took his time. He tried different pieces. And next thing you know, the puzzle was done. It was 20 or 30 minutes later, and he had hardly said a word. So that's a great example of, I think, natural mindfulness where things fell into place. He was really aware of the moment. He was in the moment and not thinking about the past or the future. He was just there. So some good examples and ways you can talk with kids about it. Now, mindfulness really does help the brain in so many ways when you're young. It helps you to focus better and longer. It helps kids to learn how to stay calm and confident in the face of challenges. So I think it's a great skill for them to kind of build self-esteem and self-confidence, knowing that they can handle difficult situations. It can lower stress by lowering social anxiety. It can lower performance anxiety, and it can really increase happiness, because usually when you feel less stressed, you're more happy. It can help kids to develop that sense of patience, taking their time and doing something right. And it really helps, and it's one of the few things that helps, I would say this way, with executive functions in kids. Working memory, we mentioned attention, flexible thinking, impulse control. So it really helps all these areas, and I think that's a wonderful thing to know about. The really cool thing about mindfulness for kids is that anything, any activity can be mindful. eating, singing, washing your hands, listening, drawing, cleaning your room. Anything can become mindful if you just work with the kids and talk them through what that process would look like. And one thing I do want to comment on tonight is this idea that, believe it or not, using electronic media with children can be mindful as well. And I think that this gets confusing because you would almost think that the multimedia kind of immersive way that, media tends to grab us and our kids is almost antithetical to the idea of mindfulness, but it can be done. And let's think about a couple of things. First of all, many parents, I think, are fretting nowadays with the sheltering in place rules about their children's overuse of media on a given day, because that's one of the few things they can do during the day. It's hard to get out of the house and do other things. But one thing I would say is it's more about the quality of the media experience than it is the quantity. So I think parents can know that they can probably ease up a little bit and not worry so much about how much time kids are spending on electronic media. But I think it's important to think about and talk with your child about the quality of the experience. Not all screen time is created equal. So for example, 30 minutes watching a silly cartoon or 30 minutes playing a really, let's say, intense, maybe violent video game is different than 30 minutes or even more time spent doing something educational online, or sitting and watching a travel documentary of a beautiful country with your parent, or learning about how to cook or maybe paint, or develop a new skill. So not all screen time is equal. So that's another thing to think about for parents. So how do you use electronic media mindfully? Well, just a few quick tips. Number one, intention. I think you want to set your intention with kids that they're not to go on electronic media like an iPad and just scroll through everything mindlessly because they're bored. You want them to use media with intention and select something that they want to accomplish in going onto this electronic gadget. Maybe they want to learn something new. Maybe they want to research a topic. Maybe they want entertainment, but be really clear with them. And it's about developing and kind of turning to electronic media for a specific purpose, not doing it mindlessly. Secondly, I think be present, not just with the media itself, but really use all of your senses to have this media experience. So for example, if you're holding a cell phone or iPad, be aware of the feeling of the iPad or the cell phone on your hand. Notice your breathing, notice your posture. Notice what you're hearing from this electronic media experience through your ears. Obviously you're going to see a lot through your eyes, but really try to help the kids to immerse themselves in the experience, slow it down, and just really stay focused on that thing and all of their senses. I think the other thing to remind them about is perspective in terms of social media. So many kids are on Snapchat or Instagram. They're communicating with friends, and they have to remember that oftentimes what happens on those kinds of social media is that people present the best versions of themselves. It's like their personal highlight reel. And we have to remind kids that when they use media mindfully, they have to be aware of that, because if you look at somebody else and what they're posting on social media and it looks like their life is perfect, that can make you feel bad. So remember that that's probably not the case, and we have to find some balance and encourage your kids to post things on media, social media, that are authentic and balanced and that really reflect their interests and their and things that inspire them. And then finally, certainly I would say avoid the negative stuff. There's a lot of negative people and a lot of negative websites out there, and things that are highly critical, hateful, and just pure evil and make us feel bad. Obviously, you want to rein in that content. A couple of, and so that's kind of a summary of some tips for mindful use of electronic media. Now, a couple of quick resources I want to leave you all with for kids and mindfulness. There's a great website. Susan Kaiser Greenland has her website, and it's just like it sounds at susankaisergreenland.com. But she has a great number of resources for kids and teens all about mindfulness. She's also created a a wonderful set of activity cards called Mindful Activity Cards and Games. And kids really will get a kick out of that. There's also a smartphone app called Stop, Breathe, and Think that is a wonderful mindfulness introductory application for teenagers and younger kids. There's also a great book CD combination by Eileen Snell, S-E-N-L, S-N-E-L, called Sitting Still Like a Frog, and take a look at that for the younger kids. They will really love it. And then finally, for parents, there's a great book by a pediatrician named Michelle Bailey called Parenting Your Stressed Child that talks about whole family mindfulness practices that I think you'll enjoy as well. And then also on the website, we'll put up some information about mindfulness activities you can do at home with your kids. One called the glitter jar and one involving a snow globe. They're similar, but those are great activities for the whole family. And it would get everybody started on the mindfulness path together. All right, I think we have some time for questions next.
Yeah, well, thank you, Tim. That was great. And it's so interesting to me how the mindfulness kind of practices that are good for kids are also so good for adults. You know, it's the simple stuff.
I agree.
And I also love—
it makes it more fun.
It does. And I love what you said about holding the cell phone with mindfulness. You know, like you can do anything. You can apply mindfulness to anything if you choose to.
Exactly.
So we do have some time for questions. Let me start with this one. It seems hard to get things done lately, even when I know I have more time. I know part of it is anxiety and ruminating over all the stuff happening right now. How can I get small tasks done amidst this exhausting, ruminating mind? Well, let me say that you're not alone in that. I think there's a real paradox that we think when we have a lot more free time, we'd be able to get a lot more done, but I don't think it quite works that way. I think there's something about being busier, maybe even being just a little bit stressed, that makes us more focused and productive. So I think some of what you're describing really is a common experience right now with this drastic change in our lifestyles. But still, we do want to be able to get some things done. And what I'd say is maybe change your expectations of yourself a little bit. You know, I think I said something in the very first session about my feeling so excited about this sort of enforced sabbatical or retreat that I thought I was going to get all these great things done around the house, and I've hardly done any of them. But I have sort of also just kind of changed my expectations of that. But I also think that it really can help to pick small things and say, today I am going to get this one thing done. Maybe it's, instead of your whole house, maybe it is one drawer or one closet or something that by the end of the week, you're going to have taken that on and accomplished it. But being very intentional about it, getting yourself to go do it, whether you feel like it or not. And remembering that, there is this sort of weird thing that when we slow down, we just aren't as focused and productive as maybe we typically are with our busy lives.
There's a question here, a couple of questions. One quick one I can answer. Favorite books to begin learning about mindfulness? I'd say for adults, anything by Jon Kabat-Zinn. He has a book CD combination, for example, that's very good. And then we'll post some of that stuff on the website for you. And then for kids, I mentioned this book by Eileen Snell, Sitting Still Like a Frog, really well done. And I think young kids would really enjoy that. There's also a great book for teenagers called Mindfulness for Teen Anxiety. You can take a look at that. It's available like on Amazon, but those are all good places to start. Another person asked, what mindfulness practices would you recommend for kids with anxiety and fear, particularly, for example, fear of getting sick or their grandparents perhaps getting sick? Well, one of the really nice practices I mentioned, and we can kind of do this in our imaginations, is you could have the kids involved, and they could do this together with their parents or even their grandparents, depending on the situation. But one of the nice practices has to do with this idea of a snow globe, or if you can imagine maybe a jar filled with water that you sprinkle in some glitter. And one of the ideas is that oftentimes when we wake up in the morning, you can imagine, if you think about the snow globe metaphor, we wake up in the morning and we're kind of quiet, and it's like the snow globe, snow has settled down. You're looking at a clear snow globe, and there's no particulates kind of floating up in the area. And you've oftentimes, when you wake up in the morning right away, you'll feel calmer and quiet and kind of clear-headed. As the day progresses, as the fear builds, you have anxiety, you have stress, you have demands on your time, you have other things that are maybe bothering you or stressing you. You could imagine then, it's like if you shook up the snow globe, all those emotions, those negative and difficult emotions are kind of flying around. Each one is a snowflake, if you will, in the snow globe. So one great practice is to imagine that you can just sit, and you can just do this in your imagination. You know, lie down or sit down, put your hand on your belly, and just breathe very slowly and evenly in and out to about the count of 5 seconds. And imagine as you do that, the snowflakes in the snow globe are settling down gradually and slowly. And with each and every breath, they're settling a little bit more, and the snow globe is clearing. And along with that, at the same time, you know, you could imagine that your fears and your negative thoughts and all these strong emotions that might be bothering you are settling in as well. And, you know, over time, maybe a minute or two, you could imagine by the time the snow globe has cleared, the snowflakes have settled, that you feel very clear-minded again, if you will. You notice that those thoughts and strong emotions have settled, and you're kind of back to a good place, a balanced point. So that's one good example of a way you could start with a child of really any age.
Those are great suggestions. I think we have time for one more question. Here it is. How long does it take to start to reduce the second arrows? How often should I practice? I've been doing this for 50 years and it seems permanent. So let me say that it does not take long at all. And you don't have to become a master meditator in order to begin being able to apply this concept. So there are people, I'm quite sure, on this retreat tonight who maybe have not heard these concepts before, who could go out tonight or tomorrow, experience something that triggers a strong emotional reaction of some sort, and could apply it immediately. That being said, it can take a really long time to get really good at it. And then, of course, there are very different levels of suffering, if you will. So the example I gave about my hip pain is not that big of a deal, really. It's not so terribly hard to see myself doing that. But somebody who experienced a severe trauma, let's say in war or sexual abuse or something like that, that's a whole different level. And I don't think it's right to expect that we somehow should become good enough at this that we can eliminate those things from our lives, at least not right away or not easily. And certainly don't think that you're doing it wrong or you're not good at this if you can't do that. My own experience is that I still do the second arrow thing. I'm not immune to that. What's different is that I don't stay in it as long. So the damage is less, if you will. It just doesn't take me as many days or weeks or months, you know, to get out of a funk or a reaction as it used to. Now, if something is really strong, if I'm hit by a really, you know, something triggers one of my old wounds, I can still feel badly for maybe for a few days, but by and large, it's usually a day or less now. And so for me, that's real progress. But remember, you cannot stop the thoughts from arising. And I'm not even sure it's realistic to expect that you wouldn't have that second arrow reaction. But as soon as we notice that we're doing that, we can learn to step out of it and let the damage be as minimal as possible. So I think we're out of time. Please come and join us next week. It'll be sort of a follow-up to this talk where we're gonna focus more on emotions and especially what to do with the difficult, kind of unpleasant emotions that none of us really want to have, but we do anyway. So please join us in a week.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.